You know, the creativity of these murders continues to amaze. Or at least that's the case with me. I'm constantly being surprised at how abs- both abstract and very clear that these murders are. Clear in the sense that you can kind of see the serial killer's mindset in in how they've chosen to present their victims. Now, I'm not saying that like I'm going to turn into a serial killer, but I can at least appreciate how morbidly creative that this show is. With this episode, when I saw the promos and heard the synopsis, I just thought, really, are they going to do another procedural episode where they just catch the killer of the week? Um, and they do, but this show does not necessarily fall back on that trope enough to make it distracting, and B, more so than any other weekly killer, this particular episode has a serial killer that who whose story and whose motivations tie in tie in the most with what is going on in the seasonal arc. And honestly, that was very welcome. It was very nicely integrated. I never really felt like they were telling two separate stories. I never feel like that while watching this show, but in retrospect, there is kind of a certain okay. I'm sorry, I'm tired, but there is kind of a certain disconnect between at times. I'm not saying this is a recurring problem on the show, but sometimes, as was the case with the Beehive woman, there is kind of a disconnect between what's going on with the serial killer and what's going on with the seasonal arc, like in terms of Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter and whatnot. But but yeah, here it was integrated very nicely. It's like I said, it tied in to the arc and the central characters more so than I would have ever expected. So so basically, the killing this week is they find a dead horse in a stable, and it looks like the horse has had a C-section performed. So after cutting open the womb, they discover a corpse inside, the corpse of a person. So that's not all. That's not all. Upon taking the corpse to upon taking the woman's corpse to the lab, after cutting her open, they discover they discover a bird in her body, which is still alive. The bird is still alive, and it flies off. They catch it, of course, but that's not important. And the recurring theme in basically all of the plots of this episode is a theme of rebirth, of something seemingly dying or going into a shell or chrysalis, and then subsequently coming out of that enclosure in a visibly changed state, or much better and more grand than it previously was. Now you see where this could come in with Will Graham. You see how one could easily interpret his rebirth as him trying to repair his, or seemingly trying to repair his relationship with Hannibal Lecter, and resuming his therapy even after A, he was incarcerated in the mental hospital, and B, after he indirectly tried to kill Hannibal Lecter. So that's how that ties into the recurring theme. And when it came to the actual serial killer, that this was one of the more tragic examples, because there is a twist. They have this scene where they interrogate a suspect, but it turns out he is mentally challenged. He's been kicked in the head by a horse. He's had recurring mental problems, And at first, it leads you to believe that, oh, it's this guy. It's so obviously this guy. He's acting all nervous when under pressure. He very nearly, he has to force himself to look at the photograph of the dead woman. And he asks, well, is the bird okay? Is the bird okay? So, right there, you think, okay, it's this guy. But that's not all. The plot thickens after that, and I won't spoil how, but again, it's keeping with that theme of rebirth. How this guy was basically how he was trying to atone for his wrongs and try and bring something back. Now I don't really think I'm spoiling much by saying this, but this episode mentions the belief that if a person dies, then their soul subsequently leaves their body in the form of a bird. So now you kind of see what the killer's mindset is starting to be. But when it actually gets to the point where you find out who the real killer is, then it's appropriately tragic, and it does indeed turn out to be more complicated than was previously thought. So I like the serial killer more than the weekly serial killer, more so than a lot of other examples on this show. And again, not that this show handles that badly, but I'm just saying that this episode in particular had a standout in just how emotionally invested I was in this guy's conflict and in this guy's emotional trauma. But how was the acting? Well, the guest stars were fantastic. The main actors are consistently great. Like I said, I like this better than, primarily due to the writing and the performances. I like this better than any of the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter movies. In fact, I like Mads Mikkelsen better as Hannibal Lecter than I do Anthony Hopkins. And that's not to discredit Anthony Hopkins in any way, but I think this show just brings more to the table. The imagery is still, like I've said, very morbidly creative, very appropriately shocking, and the very demented ways in which this show goes about the serial killings and how the victims are portrayed, or how they are posed upon the police finding them. It's very poetic in a way. You can kind of see how from a poetic standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, you can kind of see where these serial killers are coming from. You not only do you see where they're coming from emotionally, not only do they give them a legitimate motivation for wanting to kill, but also you understand why they go about whatever method that they choose. And not a lot of shows do that. So to be able to pull that off, and to pull it off with such a strong sense of style, again, is really a testament to the creators of this show. I can't believe I've never heard of Brian Fuller before. I've heard of David Slade, but I can't believe I've never heard of Brian Fuller. I must have been living under a rock. This guy has such talent. As well as all of the other people in charge of making these episodes. If this show gets canceled, oh my god, I will have no faith in and it's not a pretty a lot of the sites aren't necessarily pretty, or at least not in the traditional sense. I mean, there's some pretty gruesome imagery on this show. But it's handled in such a way, in such an artistic way, in such a mature way, that it does not feel exploitative. And like I said, if this show gets canceled, if such potential gets lost because of poor ratings, then I will have no faith in America. America has already diminished my faith by in its people by giving more money to Grown Ups 2 than Pacific Rim. I'm sorry. And also going to see House on the End of the Street instead of Dread. But I'm seriously digressing at this point. How was the rest of the episode? Well, like I said, the acting is fantastic. The visuals are still hauntingly beautiful. I know I'm getting into pretty creepy territory here by saying that, but the visuals are still striking. The serial killings are still a sight to behold, although not necessarily on a full stomach. How are the relationships with the characters? Well, I really liked the analogy that Will Graham used at the beginning of the episode, where he and Jack are ice fishing, which that was a nice little moment of reconciliation between him and Jack Crawford, just to show the viewer where they are at in terms of rekindling their friendship. It wasn't always a nice friendship, but you can tell that they have a mutual respect for each other. But the analogy that Will uses when ice fishing is you have to, since the fish's metabolism is low, you have to use live bait and basically appeal to their natural instincts. You have to establish a scenario where it's just you and the fish, or just the live bait and the fish, and then their natural instincts will take over. It doesn't matter if their metabolism is low, they will want to take that bait. And then you can subsequently catch the fish. So that's obviously, it's a little blatant, but it's obviously that's meant to tell us how Will plans to catch Hannibal Lecter, and basically telling us right out why he chose to resume his therapy is because he is trying to appeal to Hannibal Lecter's instincts. He's trying to catch him in the act. He's trying to create that environment where it's just him and Hannibal Lecter. Hopefully that will lead to his subsequently proving that Hannibal is the cannibal. Hannibal is the Chesapeake Ripper. So, we obviously know where this eventually ends up, but how they actually go about it, I mean, it goes back to that old saying, it's the journey that's important, not the destination. We obviously know that Hannibal Lecter is eventually going to get caught, but how this show goes about showing that is what really makes the whole thing interesting. And to be able to make a prequel interesting in that you have no idea what's going to happen, to show that you are bold enough to kill off characters that up until this point we had assumed would survive. Again, I keep saying this, really shows the guts and the talent that these showrunners have. This show and its creators are bringing to the table, and that's something that I think the other Hannibal Lecter movies kind of missed out on. Again, I don't mean to discredit those movies. I probably should state the ones I like. Love Manhunter. I like Silence of the Lambs alright. Although, like I said before, I don't really find Clarice Starling to be nearly as interesting as Will Graham. And I like Red Dragon, not as much as Manhunter, but I do like Red Dragon. Don't like Hannibal, and definitely don't like Hannibal Rising. But with that said, this was another very solid episode of Hannibal, and as always, it has you on the edge of your seat, wondering what's going to happen next. Like I said, the weekly serial killer and the meaning behind the killings were tied in much more nicely to the central plot. It didn't feel like a B plot. It felt like a pivotal part of the central plot. The imagery here of rebirth and the message that the serial killer is trying to get across is very applicable to the central characters, and we later find out just how much. Like in the last 10 seconds of the episode, Hannibal Lecter makes a revelation that I'll admit, in retrospect, does kind of raise questions about how far he plans in advance, but it does throw in a little more twist, into an episode already riddled with twists, in that maybe Will's rebirth isn't going in the direction that he hoped it would. Again, they're not going for the obvious route. And even if they did, I wouldn't have faulted them on it. It's not so obvious that it's cliched, the route they were going with Will trying to recover. But Hannibal Lecter's plans for him, and how his plans are kind of similar to that of the horse killer, of the horse chrysalis murderer. It's kind of eerie, even for this show. I mean, yeah, it is kind of ridiculous in that how far in advance is Hannibal planning, especially since he just met Will at the beginning of this show, but overall it's well acted enough that you don't really think about that. You're thinking about the very atmospheric, the very brooding atmosphere that this show sets up, and it feels well deserved. So when I say that this is another strong episode, I wish I could bring more to the table when I say that, because like I said, this was a unique episode in that yeah, it obviously moved the story forward, but it also threw a few twists in there that basically signified, okay, maybe this story is not going to proceed. Maybe this story continuation isn't going to proceed as everyone thought it would. So yeah, I really like this episode. Great imagery, great acting, great writing as always. And the little advantage that this episode had over the others was, again, the fact that everything tied together so nicely. So very interested to see what happens next. I wish they had given Dr. Chilton's death a little more... What's the word I'm looking for? I wish they had at least brought it up instead of immediately forgetting about him. And maybe they'll bring it up in the next episode. I don't know. I'm willing to give this show the benefit of the doubt. And we move ever closer to what we were eventually shown happens at the end of the season. So until next time, feel free to leave comments. And again, I sound like a broken record, but watch this show. It's brilliant.